Thank you very much. Well, that is actually really remarkable that you guys are all here from Santa Barbara. So I've been doing self-driving and autonomy for over 20 years. It sounds pretty crazy to say at this point. It seems to me that I was a teenager not that long ago. Um, One of the things that I've learned is really about education. Um, I've had over 100 interns over the last 20 years, working at a national lab, working at DARPA, working at um, my own company, 5D Robotics, that I built for 10 years. And across the board, some of these fundamental lessons I'd love to share with you. They're actually lessons that I've learned in three completely different areas, right? One of them is being a father. I've got a 19-year-old and a 21-year-old, and raising them taught me a lot. Teaching robots, right, was the other way. And I started sort of training and teaching robots very young. Actually, I started when I was young. I think the first robot I had was back when I was like 9 years old, actually. But what I'd like to share with you is sort of the lesson I've learned about feedback. Feedback's like one of my favorite things to think about and talk about. It's important for athleticism, right? I did like 4 varsity sports in college, and I feel that coaching has been that other thing that's taught me a lot about feedback and learning. And so what's amazing is in our world right now, whether you're a robot or a student or an athlete, you get lots of feedback, right? And you know, if you're on social media, you get tons of feedback. You get likes, sometimes you get nasty comments, but very little of it is actionable. And so I really want to kind of communicate that for me and for my role as a CEO, my role as a coach, my role as a parent, and my role as a robot teacher. Actionable feedback is the key. So let me give you an example. When I coach soccer, I would watch, you know, the kids kick the ball over the goalpost, right? Over and over again in games. And of course, what is the feedback that you then give? You say, don't kick the ball so high, right? But honestly, that's not that helpful, because every single athlete who's ever kicked the soccer ball over the goal knows that they kicked the ball too high. They don't need help understanding what the goal is, right? They know where the goalpost is. What they really need is actionable feedback. But what's so incredible is that we hardly ever give that, right? So an example of actionable feedback in this case is saying, get your body weight over the ball, get your knee over the ball. As you come around the ball, make sure that you're forward so that that ball stays down, right? So that's actionable. It may not always be easy to do, but at least you're giving actionable feedback, meaning that you're crafting behavioral input. So as a roboticist, when I want to tell a robot how to do a behavior, whether it's how to drive an autonomous car, how to fly an autonomous drone, how to you know, keep an autonomous shuttle from going on the sidewalk, again, it's all about feedback. But that feedback has to be the following, right? It has to be real time, meaning that giving feedback long time afterwards, where you basically say, hey, you did a good job driving, useless. Or the alternative is negative feedback, saying after you've been driving for a while, like, hey, you're a really bad driver. That is feedback, it's just not actionable. And so much of what we give to teenagers in the educational space is not actionable, right? You write an essay, you get a grade back, and you're like, well, I got a 74. I don't know, like, is that good? It's not good, but I don't know what to change, right? And in fact, you made the argument that grades themselves are not actually that useful, right? I actually was educated in Scotland, grew up in Scotland. They didn't have grades for me the entire time I was educated there, but they did give a lot of actionable feedback. So in other words, your teacher would give you a ton of written, very careful narrative feedback about your behavior and what you needed to work on and so on and so forth. So in robotics, what I found was that you can't just tell a robot like, hey, good job. or bad job. You can't say, hey, you did a bad job driving today. That's not actionable. And the more that I really, kind of focused on how to educate robots, the more I realized, my God, it's hard. But once you start getting that mindset where you're able to provide sort of actionable feedback in real time, it's wonderful to watch that robot learn and develop and start to behaviorally shape itself, which leads me to the second point, which is that I'm a big believer in intrinsic, self-motivated behavior. So in other words, if as a teacher, you're constantly telling people exactly what to do, you're not building that intrinsic, self-motivated desire, that hunger to learn and improve, right? So in other words, much of sports, by the way, I think is almost a form of abuse, because we give kids, 2-hour swim practices, they swim back and forth, we yell at them or we don't yell at them, but it's still a lot of being told what to do, right? Do this set on this time. I'm your coach. You're basically my robot. And I'm going to instruct you on exactly what time to do and exactly how to perform. And this is true of so many sports, whether it's gymnastics or water polo or swimming or whatever. Whereas what I've become a big believer in is trying to sort of motivate things internally, so that even if you didn't get coaching from me for 2 weeks, you would know what to do and you would take agency in the training, and because you are the only one in the universe that actually knows how you're feeling, right? You have this unique opportunity to be the arbiter, to be essentially the master of your own educational process. And believe it or not, this was a huge part of what made my robots able to go into caves and bunkers and tunnels in Afghanistan and Iraq and all these different places where robots really had to make their own decisions. I would put robots into tunnels, even under the border going into Mexico, drug tunnels, essentially. There are a few crazy things we did to map out tunnels. We didn't know where they went. They went deep underground. And essentially, I had to give the robot authority over its own decisions. We call this mixed initiative control. You, the robot, need to decide if you have enough power left to get home, right? You, the robot, you have to decide whether you need to rub your tracks up against the wall of the tunnel, because maybe you can't turn around otherwise, right? Normally we would say, don't touch anything, right? Use guarded safe motion. But maybe even these fundamental premises, which we always loved and trusted and believed in, like don't ever touch anything in the environment, we basically gave the robots the ability to change that, to make their own decisions. Say, well, I mean, honestly, we've been trying, we the robot, to get out of this. We've been stuck for 5 minutes. Maybe we need to shift our parameters and actually allow ourselves to drive up the side of the tunnel, and maybe we'll hurt the side of the tunnel, but at least we'll get back, right? And so that ability to kind of control your own destiny is important for an athlete, it's important for a student, it's important for a robot, it's important for humans and robots, because it's a fundamental premise. Another point I always make is that actually, if you want a robot or a human to solve problems, to be ingenious, to invent, to innovate, and to essentially sort of solve really tough problems, we have to let them make mistakes, right? When I did a lot of the early autonomy work for the military, and essentially took like altogether like a dozen military robots and created the brain for these robots, the military was very clear in saying, David, we want these to be like human-like intelligent systems. We want these robots to be able to make up their own mind. And most importantly, we want them to be able to solve problems. And I said, great. And we gave them these robots that could learn and develop. And right away they said, well, wait a second. We have a big problem with this. And I said, well, what do you mean? Like, these robots are clearly learning, they're adapting. Isn't that wonderful? And they're like, whoa, no. The behavior is unpredictable. I was like, well, of course it is. They're learning. What do you mean? And they said, well, we can't have them making mistakes. And I said, well, these two things are just completely contradictory, right? Like, if you want these systems to solve problems and be creative, then you have to let them make mistakes. And I think the same thing is true for kids and students and athletes. if we're not given the opportunity to take initiative and to try things and ultimately to make mistakes, then we can't really learn and develop. So these are principles that have been so true for me in robotics. The last thing I'll say is, I think, incredibly important as you go out as teenagers and become essentially adults. You will constantly be told by the world and many times by very wise mentors that plans are the key to success. You'll hear phrases like plan the dive and then dive the plan. And there's a certain kind of person who will just say that kind of thing over and over again and really believe it, because in their life, they put a tremendous amount of faith and their ability to plan their life. I'm going to become a doctor. I'm going to go to this medical school. I'm going to make this amount of money. Plans, plans, plans. And I try to differentiate between goals and plans, because I think goals are very good. But especially right now with COVID, the world is so chaotic. It's so dynamic. We can either choose to embrace that chaos or we can choose to fight it. And I'll tell you what, the fighting doesn't work, right? Because no matter who you are, you don't have enough money, you don't have enough control. And honestly, even if you did, there are things that can happen. You could get the virus, your parents could get the virus, your school could get shut down, you could get sent home, you have to leave the country. I mean, all the crazy things that have happened, it's all unpredictable. So what we learned in robotics was that you can either create a robot that embraces all of those chaotic possibilities by being very responsive and adaptive, or you can be planning centric and you can say, I'm creating a robot. It has a plan and it is going to stick to it. And here's the reality. Uber is an example. Uber spent 2.5 billion over the last few years on its advanced technology. It created autonomous driving, it touted it, it marketed it, and it did not work. And the main reason it did not work, they just sold it, basically closed down the whole thing, is because it's too model centric. The idea was you model the vehicle, you know exactly how it will perform. You have these wonderful algorithms that then say, if I put this much force into the steering wheel, the car will turn this way. I know this because I've modeled it. I've got a perfect model. And moreover, more importantly even, I've modeled all of San Francisco. I know where every single edge is. I spent literally $50 million mapping it all out with high definition lasers. And my map is so good that my robots will always succeed, right? Wrong. No matter how much effort you put into making these perfect maps, there will always be pedestrians, there will always be snowbanks, now arguably maybe not in San Francisco, but in other places like Boston. There will always be dust, rain, fog, and snow. There will always be construction patterns and so on and so forth. And you know what? Even things like how much air is in the tires and whether there's a strong headwind, all of those things affect the model. So in the end, what a lot of computer scientists and very smart people would say is, oh, so you need a better model. You need a model that includes the headwind, a model that includes, you know, the tire inflation, a model that includes whether there's snow on the ground or ice on the ground. And in theory, this is almost a philosophical argument. In theory, everything can be put into a simulation. And ultimately, you end up with like the Matrix if you watch the movie, right? You could, in theory, have a simulation or a model which is as complex as the real world. But at that point, you basically have created a new reality. And even in those cases, right, there are always going to be the things that you haven't planned for. And so my advice to you is don't fight that, embrace the chaos, right? Chaos is the source of ingenuity, innovation, humor, right? Embrace that and love it. Prepare, become strong, become tough, become educated. Don't cling to a plan, right? What I like to say is so many people believe that they're playing chess, right? They want to believe that the states and the board are known and that even though chess is complex, it's somewhat predictable. If I move my piece here, I know and can predict what will happen next. But my life hasn't been like a chess game. My life is more like a crowded ice skating rink. I can't really predict what all these other ice skaters are going to do. Some are slow, some are fast, some are, you know, moving in very aberrant patterns. And that is the way life is. And you know what? That is the way self-driving is in the city of San Francisco, right? No matter how much effort you put into predicting and modeling, there's always going to be some random 3-year-old or some homeless person or some skateboarder or some cyclist who does something that's not in your model. And so my advice to you is don't let that depress you or kind of stultify you. Look at that as an opportunity to adapt, right? And so those are sort of the principles that I am trying to live my life with. Those are the principles that I've imparted to my robot, and all the many different robots that I've done over time. And I remember a forklift that we did for Toyota where we autonomized the forklift. And because it was in this big sort of construction yard where everything was supposed to be safe, the forklift wasn't allowed to move unless it could predict and model a perfect path that was guaranteed to be safe. The problem was, in practice, there were 300 other vehicles constantly moving around in this environment, driven by humans. And so even though the forklift had a fantastic planning algorithm, it could never really be fully certain that it had a fully safe path through the environment because it didn't know where everyone else was going to go. So in the end, that forklift was completely useless because it would never move forward, right? I'm a cyclist. I bike and race in pelotons of cyclists who are incredibly unpredictable. And there's never a safe path from the back of the peloton to get the win, right? And so you kind of have to jostle your way through, kind of, again, embracing the chaos. And so for me, that's a model of how we all need to live our lives. And maybe you'll find life to be different. Maybe you're smarter than I am. Maybe you can predict better than I can. I wish I could do a better job. But the reality is I love the desultory world around me, and my response to all of this, whether it's COVID or the changes that always occur in robotics programs over the years, is to be as adaptive and flexible as possible. So I think that uses up my time. I'd love to open it up to questions if I have any time left. So Marcelo, it's up to you.
The next speaker is actually in the sports industry, so you guys should hang out as well. He's in LA, so not too far. But Wayne kindly offered to start a little bit later. So Alexia, you're very keen on water polo. I mean, do you have any sports-related questions? Because I have a few questions here, but I'd like to have you asking yours first.
No, but I mean, it really depends. Like, I know for a fact that our coaches aren't too keen on telling us exactly what to do. Like, they're like, just swim and do it as best as you can. If you succeed, good. If you're slow, you can come to us and we can help you. But it's more of like, you come to us, not we go to you kind of thing. Except for things that we're like learning.
Well, that's awesome. And that makes me really happy to hear, because I do think that there are tons of great coaches out there. But I think there's coaches on either side of it. And I think historically, I mean, part of it is speaking from my experience. I had some coaches and running coaches who kind of ran me and swam me into the ground, you know what I mean? And didn't use feedback. They kind of stuck with the plan. Like, they literally had a training plan that they wrote like before the year even started. And then their goal was to have us do everything in their plan, regardless of who got injured or what was happening, right? And it was like, if you said like, well, I'm right. So my example wasn't to say like all, obviously no, not all coaches are bad. I do love the example. So my daughter played water polo in San Diego, right? And San Diego, like Santa Barbara, is very competitive. And a story that I love is that their coach left the program like out of the blue. And so for I think about a month and a half, the team didn't have a coach, and the girls sort of like coached themselves, and they won every single match. I think they won like, something like 10 matches or something like that. But they all sort of like worked together. And when they went out, they didn't really have, again, a plan, and they didn't have preordained plays. And they just sort of played like in the Zen state, right? Where they passed and they did little, sort of small passes, and everything was just sort of very peer-to-peer and self-organizing. And they loved it, and it just worked really well. But then they brought in a coach because they felt that they had to have a coach, And that coach was so big on these pre-made plans, and he would make them drill the plan to be done exactly in a certain way. But what was really confusing to the kids was that, the plays often included like multiple passes, and the coach wanted them to do the passes exactly the way they'd been planned. And he kept sort of saying like, no, if you do this plan right, it will work. It will work. It's a brilliant plan. And they never worked. And they lost like 10 games in a row. So they went from winning 12 games to losing 10 games. And the real reason was that these sort of pre-made plans just didn't work, right? Because they weren't able to respond to the movement of the other players, right? So it's kind of an obvious example. But I just, as a parent kind of watching this, I was like, this is just not working, right? But I really feel that's the way a lot of CEOs act. It's the way a lot of boards of directors act. But again, not all. I'm just saying it's sort of like, it's almost like a mental disease when you believe, for instance, that you can create a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet will have the growth of your company and the revenues that you'll make every month. I'm going to get this contract from Disney. I'm going to get this contract from IBM, and you map it all out like 5 years in the. I mean, it's literally what you're supposed to do as a CEO. You're supposed to map out your revenues for like 5 years, and I'm here to tell you, it does not work. And the more innovative your company, the less well it works, because there's so much that you don't control, right? I mean, you can't plan for COVID. And so the degree to which you then stick with this plan and say, no, we're going to get Disney on this date, and if I don't, then fire the CEO or whatever, it just doesn't work. And so those are sort of examples in my life of where, an inability to sort of think on the fly, an innovative, unwillingness to sort of be flexible can be a problem. But, I think what I'd like to think is that the world of sports is becoming, more and more sort of tuned to the individual, right? That would certainly be my hope. And like, for instance, when I coached, I tried to give every single runner their own completely individualized program that was based on them instead of the team, right? So that's kind of my coaching philosophy. But obviously, if you have like 50 kids, that might be hard.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
No.
Well, I have a few comments actually. You really make me think about a drone footage of a Vietnamese street crossing, where it's complete chaos. I mean, it's very similar to the ice skating analogy, where you can't predict to a certain extent what other people are going to do, because you can empathize. You can imagine if that guy in that moped happens to be in my position, this is how he's going to think. And the reason why I mentioned that is that traffic accident rates in Vietnam are actually lower than in most other countries. Like, it looks ridiculously chaotic, but what they do is to slow down the speed of the traffic up to the point in which the human brain can cope. So a little bit like with the Peloton situation, where you're going very fast, but that's because you trained yourself to be able to react to the lightning fast speeds in that kind of context. And that would lead us to a rabbit hole of a conversation about VUCA and your background in the military. And I don't want to take too much of a time, but it's absolutely fascinating to have your experience here. I think is really, really relevant for teenagers, for so many reasons. The topics that we covered related to sports, but also robotics and much more. And I hope you guys have a chance to meet in person, because you're in Santa Barbara, right? So you can continue the conversation in a safe environment whenever the pandemic would allow.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is Isabel just chiming in real quick. Where are you in Santa Barbara?
I'm actually right next to Cold Spring Elementary School in Montecito. So if you come up like 192.
Okay, great. Well, let's connect on LinkedIn and we can figure out a time to meet up.
That'd be great. Yeah, that's fantastic. And who is Happy Turtle, by the way?
Happy Turtle actually happens to come from Vietnam. He was one of the speakers early on today, talking about his projects to extract 500 liters of drinking water from humidity for refugee camps. which is the background that got him to the World Economic Forum as a global shaper. But the Happy Turtle product is in fact straws made of manioc and potatoes. So he came up with a concoction that allows you to have functional straws that biodegrade in 90 days, unless you throw that in a fish pond, in which case they're going to eat it immediately, because apparently potatoes are quite popular with the fish community as well. And I was discussing, so I'm assuming that he just turned it on, but he went on to do something else because he was curious to follow the other sessions. But I was discussing the possibility, in fact, of creating a teenager entrepreneur version of his biodegradable straws, so that teens, a little bit like with the lemonade stands and the cookie sales, they can start learning the basics of becoming an entrepreneur in a very safe environment. So the concept here being grandma, grandpa, co-aunt or uncle will buy you a box for 99 bucks that has everything you need to learn how to build a business, which in this case is selling a novelty project that is good for the environment. That's one out of many products. I mean, the other one being Chinese tea capsule for Keurig machines. It was also a speaker. And the discussion then is like, let's create a bundle of this kind of a Keurig knockoff, because obviously you can't use the Keurig brand name or K-cups and stuff, but they are allowed to sell something that would work with the capsules. Same thing with the Nespresso systems. And create something for teenagers to, you know, get a box for Christmas or for the birthday, and then they will invite people from the neighborhood. They will have all the capsules that they need with the different flavors, and the idea being that the profits, so they start with zero investment. Literally, they had an angel investor that took no equity in their business, and they will then be in a position not only to learn how to operate the business from A to Z, but A to Z, sorry, all Americans here in the call today. Even though you did go to Scotland for studies. And the objective, of course, being that either they'll support a local charity with the profits from the tea sale or the potato straw sale, or they will keep the money for a university fund, right? So to support the education. But you just need to get something that is super simple. Like you're literally selling cups of tea. A couple of cookies on the side would be nice, but totally optional. Or you're selling straws that do not kill turtles, right? Because they're not made of plastic. And try to get to community support. And one of the precepts of Wisdom Accelerator is to get teenagers to do non-profit work that is then convertible into a for-profit activity, so that they find their purpose, they put a lot of passion and time into that to help out either a local charity or even to have their own education fund. But the skills that they're learning will be the 80-20, the Pareto rules. Is like, yeah, now you've learned the hard bits of how to get something to go from the beginning to the end. Converting that into a for-profit activity should be much quicker. And the objective here being that I would like to have as many 18-year-olds as possible, then legally being in a position to sign contracts, having the skill sets to be able to start being their own bosses. So it's a long-term dream. We'll get started with it.
Very, very cool. Very cool. Well, Alexi and Isabel, I'm happy to meet up with you. I'm actually still learning about Santa Barbara, but I'm loving it so far. And Marcelo, I know I've taken up more time than I was supposed to, but thank you for this opportunity.